We are now beginning the unit number 4, and this is lecture number 11, our early Christian Muslim interaction. The important thing here in this is going to be the apologetic approaches between Muslims. We're talking primarily about Christians this time, and the apologetic approaches to Muslims between the 7th and the 10th century. Let's keep in mind that Islam arose in the 7th century, so that means that very shortly after Islam comes into being, there is this, I guess we can call it, unfortunate encounter. And we'll see that through various things, not only the apologetic methods used, not that they're all wrong, but primarily because of the Crusades. This was a Christian reaction against Islam, and we're still paying for it. The first one is John I, a Jacobite who was the patriarch of Antioch, who apparently had some interaction with Caliph Uthman. Remember, Caliph Uthman is the third caliph, but he also had a debate apparently with one other person, and it seems that this set the stage in 639, only 7 years after the death of Muhammad. John I, Jacobite, was a patriarch of Antioch, and he was summoned to defend Christian doctrine before Amr ibn al-As, who was a Muslim conqueror of Egypt. And it seems like from this point on that Muslims set the agenda. The agenda is the accuracy of Scripture, our Scripture, and the accuracy of their Scripture. Always it's comparing Scripture to Scripture. The nature of Christ, and topics like this. For example, the Harvard Theological Review, number 37, dating back to 1944, pages 269 to 332. So this is where Muslims and Christians have met. There is Emperor Leo III, who is the Emperor of Constantinople, and there is some correspondence here that he had with Umar II, 717 to 720. But I think of greater interest to us is certainly the person by the name of John of Damascus, 665 to 745. I may not be exactly right on his dates here, but the source I have says that John of Damascus lived from about that time, 655 to 745, but another source says 700 to 749. He was an apologist, and in a book that was written by Henry Dorman, Toward Understanding Islam, New York, Bureau of Publications, 1948. Chapter 1 of this book by Henry Dorman talks about the origins of polemic approach. And then chapter 2, the historical development of the early apologetic. I am better acquainted with an apologist on the Indian subcontinent, a fellow by the name of Carl Fander, who had some success in Pakistan, wrote a rather famous book called the Mizan al-Haq, or The Balance of Truth. This is a very apologetic book, and it was banned by the government of Pakistan long before I got there in 1968. And it's still banned. But it was sort of the same idea that apologetics is really the way to go. In other words, I'm not saying that there isn't a lot of valuable stuff in somebody like the works of Carl Fander, or now specifically, we're talking about John of Damascus. And I wouldn't want to say that he is totally in the wrong, but he is the founder. In other words, it is understood that John of Damascus founded polemics with Muslims. He was an eminent theologian of the Eastern Church, and Richard Bell, in his book, The Origin of Islam and Its Christian Environment, mentions John of Damascus. John of Damascus wrote the book Dialogue with a Saracen, kind of a manual for guiding Christians in their arguments with Mohammedans, as they were called. And the word Saracens comes from the word Sarah, who was sent away empty. So you get the impression that arguments with Muslims were quite common. This particular document that John of Damascus wrote had 103 doctrines against Islam, very negative of Muhammad, who was called a false prophet. He seems to ridicule Islam. And John of Damascus knew Arabic, but the question is about his approach. Some have said, well, he doesn't really know Islam. He may have known more Islam than we think, but I think the only thing that I would question is his particular approach. He calls Muslims Ishmaelites, and that is not completely accurate, because Abraham is not just the father of the Ishmaelites, because after Hagar, in other words, after Sarah died, he of course marries Hagar, but then he has other concubines as well, for instance Keturah, and so you can't just trace the Muslims back to Ishmael. He refers to Mamed, M-A-M-E-D, a false prophet and an antichrist, who probably got his information from an Arian monk. But John of Damascus did use bridges, such as the Quranic references to Jesus and to Word and to the word Spirit. But there is an element of ridicule in the approach of John of Damascus, for he says that Mamed wrote a book through a pretense of godliness that are worthy of ridicule. He says that when we ask Mohammedans how their prophet received the book, they say, while he was asleep. And we say in jest. And this proves that he was not sensible of the divine influence. We say, in other words, John of Damascus talking for Christians, why don't you have witnesses? Because everything else is done with witnesses. Marriage, purchasing something, not just faith. He says Muslims call us idolaters because we bow before the cross they despise. And then we say, why give so much significance to a stone in the Kaaba, kissing it and embracing it? He refers to a couple of passages in the Quran, and I'll mention those in a minute. John of Damascus says, we say to the Muslims that there are many foolish things that Muhammad wrote. The title for each passage, like he's talking now about the Quran, concerning the woman, or in which permits, for example, a man to take 4 wives. He's referring to Surah 4 in verse 3. And Muhammad, a co-worker, Zayd, had a beautiful wife whom Mamed, I don't know why he keeps calling him Mamed, whom Mamed wanted, and he took her. Another is concerning the camel, in which a camel from God drank the whole river. And here there is a reference to that in a couple of verses of the Quran, namely 17 verse 59 and 26 155. He also, John of Damascus refers us to some other titles of surahs, like concerning a table or concerning a heifer, and many other foolish things worthy of ridicule. I think this is the only place that I would question John of Damascus. He may have set the stage for an approach that considers Islam foolish and senseless, and he ridicules it. He seemed to mock the Muslims sometimes, Yet, undoubtedly, John of Damascus was ahead of his time in his understanding of Islam, and he used clever arguments, sometimes forcing them into a corner with his understanding of Greek philosophy. We now talk about Timothy, patriarch of the Nestorians. You see, Christianity is alive and well. You have the Eastern Orthodox Church, but you also have the Nestorians from 780 to 8819. Timothy was the patriarch of the Nestorian Church, and he disputes Al-Mahdi of Baghdad in 782. Timothy wrote the book, The Apology of Timothy, and he is an opponent of the third caliph of the Abbasids. The subject here is, who is Jesus Christ? He argues for the superiority of Christ to Muhammad because of biblical prophecy and the miracles of Jesus and the fact that these prophecies have come true. Now, according to history, the debate of Timothy with the caliph goes on for 2 years. They talk about the two natures of Jesus, difference between Father and Son, between Spirit and Word, and the historical record is that Timothy won the first day, Caliph won the second day. And Sweetman, who has written a lot about Islamic theology, says it was a debate. It was not evangelism. The biblical content was weak, and the major issue is, who is God? Who is Jesus Christ? And the Caliph said that Scripture was perverted. This is 782. So, note the charge. The debate did not show love and concern that Muslims come to Christ. It was a debate. And I don't think that debates are all that successful in winning Muslims to Christ. They do put Muslims, and Christians for that matter, in a defensive posture. Let me also mention Moffat, who has written the History of Christianity in Asia, Volume 1, page 349 and following, that in the debate, the Caliph totally misunderstood. Because you see, Christ was considered to be the Son of God, he says, in a carnal way. Also in the second day, Timothy is asked what he thinks of Muhammad, page 350. John of Damascus has said that Muhammad was a false prophet, whereas Timothy, he was a false prophet, and this is basically what Timothy has to say. Now, let's talk about Al-Kindi, Abdul Masih bin Ishaq Al-Kindi. Remember, previously when we talked about the other Al-Kindi, where we said that there were two Al-Kindis, and here is the Arab Christian, Al-Kindi, who wrote a book in 830 called The Apology of Al-Kindi. And he gets back to these old traditional topics again, the Trinity, the moral weakness of Muhammad. Sound familiar? Foreign words and the imperfections of the Quran. Muslim legalism, the life of Jesus, and this also is a very polemic work with little understanding and certainly not much grace. This was basically an attack on Islam because of the way they treat women, the way that they practice holy war. And of course, when they say things like this, then the Muslims feel that they must answer the attack. And Al-Tabri, whom we've talked about in the past, who died in 923, then he proceeds to find several prophecies and miracles performed by Muhammad. When you look at Al-Bukhari and open up the first of the 9 volumes, there are 11 miracles listed of Muhammad, and you wonder if Muslims have done this in reaction. In other words, they are going to show how Muhammad is also as great or is superior. He's the greatest prophet, and the Old Testament, New Testaments, and the Bible is full of prophecies of Muhammad. This is their approach. The Spanish martyr movement of the 9th century is brought up here not because it was a missionary endeavor, but because it affects mission. And it reflects the time. It reflects a certain type of thinking. For reference, see Alan Cutler in The Muslim World, October 1965. What was the Spanish martyr movement? It was very important in the history of Muslim-Christian encounter, and it was considered to be a model. A model for what? For Christians resisting Muslims. They would vehemently denounce Muhammad. The first one was a fellow by the name of Perfectus. They would vehemently denounce Muhammad, and then they would be martyred. It seems that they were more interested in the merits that could be won through martyrdom, and they hoped to stir up trouble against Muslims so that Christians would rise up in arms, and the movement went on until it backfired. A Muslim ruler threatened to kill all the Christians if the movement was not stopped, and it did stop. Now, I wonder what characterizes much of the interaction. If we were in the classroom right now, we could have some people talk about this or mention some things. I think that, number one, we've already discussed that Muslims seem to be setting the agenda. Number two, there is a lack and perhaps even a decline by Christians to understand Islam. There is number three, a growing gracelessness in dialogue that is more into apologetics than it is to humble Christian witness. Number four, there's a growing use of Greek philosophy by Christians and Muslims. Remember that now is in decline. There is, as we've said, there is some use of philosophy, but I think we have to remember too that, the honor-shame issue, you don't want to lose an argument. So that's the first part, and now we're going to go on to the Crusades. And that's number B, the Crusades and select Christian mission endeavors from the 11th through the 15th centuries. The Crusades are shameful. The first crusade was in 1046. It involved men and women, about 60,000 of them. They were foolhardy, they were ignorant, they were led by Peter the Hermit, and the helper was Walter the Penniless. 40,000 here under Peter and 15,000 under Walter. There didn't seem to be any particular order or discipline. Christians were robbed and tortured, and there was a terrible famine. But they did manage to take Jerusalem in 1099. So that's the first crusade. The second crusade is dated 1146. Here, this was Bernard of Clairvaux, and it was a total failure, great loss to the Christians. The third crusade, 1189, Richard the Lionhearted, who teamed up with Philip of France. The fourth crusade was Germanic. Innocent III, attempt to conquer the Eastern Church, but a complete defeat of the troops who arrived in Jerusalem and resulted in a split between the East and the Western Church that has never been healed. The fifth crusade was from 1217 through 1230. And again, the Crusaders took Jerusalem. But then again, Muslims took it back in 1244, and it remained in their hands until 1918. I have mentioned before the fact that during the Fifth Crusade, I may have not specifically said the Fifth Crusade, but it was during the Fifth Crusade that St. Francis had that encounter with a Muslim and gave a powerful witness. I just wanted to mention, too, that inasmuch as you know, the Palestinians had the territory for that long a time, right up till 1918, and then eventually in 1948, of course, Israel came into being. You can see that the Muslims had the land for a long time. They were controlling it for a long, long time. The Sixth Crusade was 1248. Now France, Louis IX, takes up the cross. We've previously seen it was England and Germany. They sailed with 1,800 ships. 50,000 joined him, but they never got there. The Seventh Crusade is 1263, set out with 36,000 troops, 36,000 people, and I understand that all but just a few of the Christians die. We wonder, was there any good from the Crusades? Dudley Woodbury, my friend and mentor, wrote an article that said, with the title of the article is When Failure is Our Teacher. And he does talk about some of the good things we can learn from the Crusades. And I think one positive thing was that the Eastern Church did, through the Crusades, come into closer contact with Muslims. So probably some good did come out of it. Some communication opened up, because then after this, then a new era starts in Christian mission. More importantly, though much of the Western Church was paranoid about Islam, others began to reach out to them, and one of them was Raymond Lull, the Spanish person from the Jesuits who became a great missionary.